Hello everyone, I am the storyteller. And today I am here to help you have a restful sleep. I know you're using this video to drift off more easily. So relax and whine and let the story guide you into your dreams. Before we begin, let me know where you're from and what time you're watching this video. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any of the exciting stories in the future. I live alone in an apartment on the second floor of a rather ordinary building. The building has a total of 4 floors and is quite long, with straight hallways on each floor. It is located about a 10-minute walk from the city in a fairly populated area. I have lived here for about 2 years and really like it, but there was one incident a few months ago that made me reconsider staying. It was an ordinary night, and I was home alone. My apartment has 1 bedroom, a living room, a kitchen, and a bathroom. I was sitting on my couch, watching TV. It was late, probably after 10 p.m. I had just gotten home from work about an hour earlier. As I was sitting there watching TV, I heard some strange noises. I assumed they were coming from my neighbor's apartment and didn't think much of it. After about 30 minutes, I suddenly felt uneasy. It was hard to describe, but I started feeling anxious and looked around. When I turned to look over my shoulder, I saw my bedroom door, only about 5 feet away, with a man peeking his head around the corner, staring directly at me. We made eye contact for just a moment before he quickly ducked back out of sight. I jumped up from the couch and, in a panic, ran straight out of my apartment. I couldn't believe what was happening. A stranger was in my apartment. Once I was in the hallway, I felt completely lost. I wanted to call the police, but I realized I had left my phone on the couch. I thought about driving away but also left my keys on the counter. Not knowing what else to do, I remembered a friendly neighbor named Courtney who lived down the hall. I knocked on her door, but unfortunately, she didn't answer. She was probably asleep since it was quite late. That's when I decided to go back into my apartment to grab my phone and keys. Maybe the guy had either left or was hiding, or perhaps I had just imagined the whole thing. Everything happened so quickly, I even questioned if I really saw it. I felt like I was going crazy. How could this guy even get in? The door was always locked, and I didn't think I had forgotten to lock it that day. When I returned to my door, I finally gathered the courage to open it. My plan was to quickly run to the couch, grab my phone, and then rush back to the door, picking up my keys from the counter on the way. It would probably take less than 10 seconds. However, when I opened the door, the first thing I saw was the man standing in my living room, facing me. I slammed the door shut just as fast as I had opened it and sprinted away. I ran down the hallway, down the stairs, and then ran outside until I reached the first floor. I couldn't get to my car because I didn't have my keys, so I walked out to the sidewalk along the road. I walked until I saw a gas station that was open. When I got there, I went inside and asked the clerk to call the police, then waited for them to arrive. When they got there, we went back to my apartment, but the man was gone. They searched all around the building and inside my place. He had stolen my laptop, wallet, and a few other things. My phone was still there, probably because it had fallen between the couch cushions and he didn't see it. I'm not sure if the man was ever found, but my best guess about how he got in was by somehow reaching my balcony. I had a small balcony, and it would be difficult but not impossible to access from the ground. The door to the balcony was closed, but I never locked it. He must have entered while I was at work. I never thought anyone would reach it from the outside. Since that incident, everything has been fine. I haven't had any break-ins or attempted break-ins. I got a new laptop and credit cards, but I still wonder how that man chose to enter my place. Did he watch me beforehand or something? I don't know, but I will never forget seeing him that night. This happened back when I was in high school. It was summer, and my parents were going on a weekend trip with some friends. That meant I would be home alone for the weekend. I didn't have any plans except to play video games and hang out. Our house was nice but nothing too extravagant. When my parents left, I thought it was pretty cool to be the only one home. It didn't happen too often. I enjoyed it right up until the second night. It was a Friday night, and I stayed up pretty late playing PlayStation. Finally, I got tired around 2 a.m. and turned off all the lights to go to bed. Just as I was starting to relax and about to fall asleep, I heard a noise. It sounded like knocking at the window in my bedroom. It was quiet, but I was sure of what I had heard. I sat up in bed and looked around. Everything was silent now. I didn't hear anything, and when I looked at the window, I didn't see anything either. I thought I was just being paranoid. I stayed up for a few minutes, looking and listening, but didn't hear anything. Eventually, I calmed down and told myself I was just worried for no reason. I lay back down and closed my eyes. In probably 5 minutes, I was relaxed again, but then I heard the knocking once more. This time it was louder, and there was no mistaking it. I sat up quickly and looked at the window. That's when I thought I saw something move out of sight. I really didn't know what it was, I only caught a glimpse. My window was next to a tree, and I was trying to convince myself it was just a branch or something, but it didn't really seem that way to me. This time, I got up and turned on my bedroom light, then moved out into the living room. It just felt safer in there. I looked out the window and didn't see anyone, but when I looked out to the street, I noticed a car parked there. It was a car I had never seen before, and it was parked somewhat in front of our house. I became very suspicious. I watched the car, wondering if anyone was inside, but then I heard a noise coming from the back of the house. This time it wasn't knocking, it sounded like someone was trying to open the back door. Hearing this, I ran back into my bedroom, jumped into bed, and covered myself with blankets. Then I called the police, told them everything that had happened, and I didn't plan to move from under the covers until they got there. I was really scared, trying my best to hide and distract myself until then. The whole time, I didn't hear any loud noises or anything. Finally, when the police arrived, I got up, but what they told me sent chills down my spine. They said that when they arrived at my house, they saw a man running away from the backyard. When they got around to the back, they found the back door was open, which meant the man had been able to get inside. I hadn't even known he ran away when the police got there, but his car was still parked on the street. He was located within the hour, and I felt much better after that. For some background, I live alone in a 2-bedroom house in a usually quiet neighborhood. One night, I was home alone, and it was getting pretty late. In fact, I was about to go to bed and feeling really tired when there was a knock at my front door. My first reaction was to wonder who on earth would be at my door at this hour. Aside from that, people rarely came knocking on my door, so I felt a bit on edge. I walked to the living room, which was at the front of the house. All my windows were covered, including the window by the front door. When I got to the front door, I pulled back the curtain and looked out, but I didn't see anybody. I carefully opened the front door and looked outside, but no one was there. I stepped out and looked all around, but whoever had knocked was gone. I did notice something on the ground, though, an envelope on the front step. I picked it up and took it inside. Once inside, I opened it. The envelope had nothing written on it, but inside was a folded piece of paper with writing on it. I read what was. It was a very mysterious note. In the letter, the writer mentioned me by name right from the start, and it gave me an eerie feeling. They simply stated that they knew who I was and where I lived, and that I should be aware of my surroundings. While there were no direct threats, the letter wasn't written carefully at all. That's what I gathered from it, but I honestly had no idea what it meant. The handwriting was really messy, making some words hard to read. After finishing the letter, I threw it away, feeling quite anxious. I looked out of all the windows but saw no one. Everything seemed like a typical quiet night. I wanted to go to bed, but I didn't feel tired anymore. I went into my bedroom and turned on the TV to try to relax. About 3 minutes later, I was starting to feel better, but that's when I heard knocking again. This time, it wasn't coming from the front door, but from the back. Immediately, I grabbed my phone and called the police, explaining what was happening. I was told that someone would be there shortly. After that, I got up and walked to a window that overlooked the backyard. When I looked, I couldn't see anyone. The police arrived relatively quickly, but whoever had knocked was gone. They searched my property and asked me a few questions, then told me to call again if anything else happened. There wasn't much they could do other than look at the letter. Since I had never seen the person, I couldn't provide any description. After the police left, I managed to fall asleep, although it took some time. Since that night, there have been no more strange events or knocks on my door. I still wonder who did that and why. The letter was very strange. It could all just be a silly prank to scare me. I really don't know anyone who would do that or why, but I'm just glad nothing like that has happened since. I live with a roommate, and this is something that happened not too long ago. We live in a small house close to the city, the rent is cheap, and everything had gone really well until this point. My roommate's name is Matt, and we get along fine, but I wouldn't call us best friends. We have different work schedules, so sometimes we don't see each other for a few days. A couple of months ago, I got home from work one night, probably around 6 p.m. When I got inside the house, I first went to the kitchen to grab a drink. When I was leaving the kitchen and entering the living room, I noticed that the back door of the house was wide open. I don't mean just unlocked, it was literally wide open. I walked over and shut it, thinking that Matt must have left it open. Both of us can be a bit careless sometimes, and I figured this was something he might do. I locked the door and shook my head, then went upstairs to my bedroom. I was there for about 30 minutes when I heard someone walking up the stairs. I was 100% sure it was Matt. I never even considered the possibility that someone else could be inside. Matt, or who I thought was Matt, reached the top of the stairs and began walking down the hallway. After he passed my closed bedroom door, I called out to him. I said, "Matt," I didn't get an immediate response, so I said, "You left the back door open." He didn't say anything back, which was a bit strange since I knew he had heard me. It seemed like he had gone to the bathroom, the spare bedroom, or most likely his own room. I walked over and opened my door, but instead of seeing Matt, I saw a different man. This guy had long blonde hair, a slight reddish beard, and was tall and thin. He looked at me, and as soon as he did, I bolted for the stairs. To my surprise, he started running after me, which made me panic. After reaching the downstairs, I felt I wouldn't make it to the front or back door in time. I would have to stop, unlock it, and then open it. In a split-second decision, I chose to run down into the basement. I know how foolish that sounds in retrospect, but in that moment of panic, it was my choice. The basement door was right by the bottom of the stairs and already slightly open. The guy was about 20 feet behind me when I ran toward the basement stairs. I could see that it was pitch black down there. Our basement was unfinished, all we really had down there was our washer and dryer, along with random pipes and beams. I didn't bother to turn on the light and just went in. When I got downstairs, I immediately turned left and hid behind the stairs, which I felt was my best hiding spot. There was literally no visibility down there at all. I heard the guy running down the stairs, and he arrived shortly after I had gotten behind the stairs. After he reached the bottom, I heard him moving around. He didn't say anything, and I had no idea what he was capable of. The man then pushed over one of the boxes. He was definitely looking for me, but I didn't know why. When it seemed he had walked further away, I considered leaving my hiding spot, but I chickened out and couldn't bring myself to do it. The spot I was hiding in was quite good, to be honest, and not very obvious if you had never been in the basement before. I just hoped the guy wouldn't think to look back there. He kept moving around, and at one point he walked pretty close to me but didn't check where I was. Somehow, he stayed down there for probably 10 or 15 minutes. Finally, he went back upstairs. When he did that, I wasn't quite sure what to do. I felt relieved that he was gone, but I worried that if I went upstairs, he would be right there waiting for me. Luckily, I had my phone on me. This was the first time I thought to call the police or even had the chance to. I dialed 911 but tried to be as quiet as possible. It was really silent down there, and I didn't want the guy to hear me. When the operator answered, I told them there was a guy in my house chasing me around, and they said the police would be there shortly. I hung up after that, trying not to make too much noise, and I didn't move from my hiding place. About 10 minutes went by. I was feeling better until I heard the basement door open again. The guy walked back down into the basement slowly and only stayed down there for about a minute before heading back upstairs. I didn't know what was going on, but luckily there was a knock on the door afterward. It had to be the police. I heard the guy running through the house. I got out from my hiding spot and dashed back upstairs to let the police in. Sure enough, it was them, and I heard the guy leaving through the back door. When I got to the top of the stairs, I told the police the guy was running away, and they were able to track him down shortly after. He had indeed entered through the back door after Matt had left it unlocked. I didn't know what he wanted, but it seemed he was after me for some reason. I hope I never see that guy again, and I also hope Matt never leaves the back door unlocked again. I remember last year, after coming home from a trip where I was out of town for a few days for work, I returned at night. I got into my apartment and started unpacking. I have a one-bedroom place with a living room, kitchen, and 1.5 bathrooms. Each room has a decent amount of space. I unpacked a few things and then went into my bedroom to continue. Usually, my apartment is quite tidy, but I had left in a bit of a rush. I had intended to wash one of the comforters for my bed, and it was lying on the ground in the corner of my bedroom. The other one was on my bed. While in my bedroom, I was taking clothes out of my suitcase, putting some in the hamper and some back in my drawers. As I was doing this, I was sure I saw the blanket in the corner move. I wasn't looking directly at it when it happened, so I stopped what I was doing and focused my attention on it. I was convinced that I saw it moving ever so slightly. This was really weird. There was no way it could move like that on its own. I stared at it for probably a minute, and it was completely still. I then got up and left the room, somewhat in disbelief. I paced around in my living room for a few moments and then walked back into my room to look at the blanket in the corner again. It was completely still and didn't move for the few moments that I looked at it. I left my bedroom again, wondering if I had gone crazy. I walked into my half bathroom, which was on the opposite side of my apartment, near the front door. When I got inside, I shut the door and splashed some cold water on my face. Maybe I was suffering from a lack of sleep, but as I was there in the bathroom, I heard footsteps coming from my bedroom area. I quickly locked the bathroom door. The footsteps stopped right outside the bathroom door, and then someone tried to open it. I sighed in relief because I had locked it. After the person attempted to open the door, I heard the front door of my apartment open and then shut, followed by silence. I was still panicking, unsure of what was happening. A few minutes later, I left the bathroom and locked the front door of my apartment, then searched around to ensure that whoever had been there had actually left. Thankfully, no one else was inside. However, I noticed that the blanket that had been in the corner of my bedroom was no longer there. It was spread out in the middle of the room. This incident happened when I was in high school, specifically during my sophomore year. I have an older brother, but he was already in college at the time. Every day, I would take the bus home from school. The bus stopped at the end of my street, and I would walk the rest of the way, usually arriving around 2:45 p.m. Our house was located halfway down the street. One day, like any other, I got off the bus, walked home, entered through the front door, and went inside. My parents weren't home from work yet, as they rarely were when I got back. Occasionally on Fridays, they would leave work early, but that day was a Thursday. I typically had the house to myself for about 1 to 3 hours. I didn't mind and would just do whatever I wanted. When I got inside, I had some homework to do and wanted to finish it quickly. I remember going upstairs to my bedroom to work on it. About 30 minutes after getting home, while I was doing my homework, I heard a knock at the front door. I wasn't sure who it could be, as we rarely had visitors. I stood up from my desk and walked downstairs to check. By the time I got there, I didn't expect anyone to still be waiting, but when I opened the door, I found a man standing there. He looked pretty average, wearing what seemed like a business uniform and carrying a briefcase. I opened the door and asked what he needed. He said he was an insurance agent. I don't remember exactly what he said, but the only word that stuck in my mind was insurance. He asked if I was the homeowner, and I told him no, my parents weren't home. The man apologized for bothering me and left. I watched him walk back down the driveway and return to my room. About 10 minutes later, something caught my eye through the window. I walked closer and saw the same insurance guy in my backyard. A bad feeling washed over me, as there was no reason for him to be back there. I saw him approach one of the back windows, looking around as if he was ensuring no one was watching. I ducked down below my window and waited a few seconds before looking up again. The man was still there at the window. He set his briefcase down and opened it. It looked like he had tools inside. He peered into the back window, pressing his hands against the glass next to his face, then went back to his briefcase, picked something up, and walked over to another window to look inside. After that, he returned to the first window. I saw him taking a kind of tool, and I was sure he intended to break in. Watching him prepare to tamper with the window, I came up with an idea. My parents clearly weren't home yet, and I had no clue when they would return. I quickly dashed out of my bedroom, tiptoeing down the stairs. I reached the door to the garage that led from the pantry. I opened it and pressed the button to open the main garage door. As I did, I carefully peered into the dining room window to see the man. Just in time, I caught a glimpse of him scrambling away. I watched him dash to the other side of our house and then return to the garage, closing the open garage door behind me. I hoped the sound of the garage door would make the man think my parents had come home, and fortunately, it worked. He ran into our neighbor's backyard, and after that, I lost sight of him, but it seemed he had kept going. I kept a close watch on the backyard, and the men didn't return. When my parents got back, I told them everything, and they were impressed with how I handled the situation. After that, the man never showed up again, and I was relieved he couldn't get inside the house. Just 2 weeks ago, I had another terrifying experience. It all happened on a Thursday night when I returned from work. Up until that point, it had been a pretty typical day. I woke up, went to the gym, came back home, got ready for work, and then headed out. I was working a closing shift that day, so I wouldn't get off until 7 p.m. Work went by as usual, and then I drove the roughly 15 minutes to get back home. After arriving, I parked my car in the driveway and got out. I currently live alone in a 2-bedroom house on half an acre of land. I walked up to my front door and went inside. My plan was to change and then make something to eat. However, I had only made it halfway to my bedroom when I heard the doorknob turning on my front door. I froze, suddenly filled with dread. I wasn't expecting anyone. As I started to turn around and walk back, the person outside began knocking on the door. I approached cautiously but felt suspicious. When I got within view of the front door, I carefully peered out a window and saw a man standing there on my front step, pressing against the door. I didn't want to answer, but he kept knocking. Then I heard him yell something. I had no idea who this guy was, perhaps he was at the wrong house. I considered answering just in case, but his aggressive banging made me hesitate. I stood just a few feet away, hoping he would leave. He demanded to be let inside and then called my name. I couldn't believe he knew who I was, and I was sure I had never seen him before. I yelled as loud as I could that I was calling the police if he didn't leave immediately. However, this didn't seem to faze him. He continued banging on my front door. I noticed he had parked his car right in my driveway. I quickly took out my phone and dialed 911, my heart racing as I explained the situation. My biggest fear was that he would try to break in. Almost at the end of my call, the man stopped, and I saw him run back to his car, then drive away. I kept a close watch to ensure his car left my street. I felt a bit better and updated the 911 operator on this new development. They sent an officer out anyway to take my statement. After that, the man was gone, and the officer, after looking around and talking to me, left as well. It was a little scary being home alone that night, and I had trouble falling asleep, but I eventually managed to doze off. I woke up the next morning around 7 a.m., initially forgetting about the craziness of the night before. As I made my way to the kitchen, I passed by a window and happened to notice a car parked right in front of the driveway. It was the same car as the night before. The man was back. I noticed he seemed to be inside it. Without hesitation, I called the police immediately, informing them that the man had returned. I carefully watched out the window for a couple of minutes. The man stayed inside, then opened his door and approached my front door again, knocking once more. I couldn't believe this guy. I still had no idea who he was or what he wanted, and I was baffled as to how he knew my name. He stayed at my door, knocking intermittently. After about 5 minutes, the police arrived. When they did, the man tried to run away, but he didn't get far and was caught by the officers. When questioned, he refused to reveal how he knew me or why he was there. All he claimed was that he just wanted to talk to me, insisting that we were old friends, which was utterly false. I'm just thankful I noticed him that morning. I believe he followed me home from work the night before without me realizing. I walked toward the front door, and he must have been following me, but at a distance. This was one of the scariest experiences of my life, and I hope I will never encounter him again. This happened when I was in high school. At that time, I lived with my parents and younger brother in our home. We also had 2 dogs. Almost every day, one of us, me, my brother, or my parents, would take them for a walk. One night, Around 8 p.m., the sun was setting, the weather was quite pleasant, and the dogs needed to go out. My parents decided to take them for a walk while my brother was at a friend's house. I was struggling with my homework, so I stayed home alone. When my parents took the dogs out, I never knew exactly when they would be back. Our neighborhood was relatively quiet but also quite large, with many streets and houses around. There was also a park not too far away. Sometimes, the walk would take about 20 to 30 minutes, but there were times it lasted over an hour. I was in my bedroom when my parents said they were going out, and I said goodbye from upstairs, then heard them leave. After that, I tried to focus on my homework, which was a math problem that I couldn't grasp. I struggled to find a solution and gradually lost track of time. The next thing I knew, I heard the front door open downstairs. I automatically assumed it was my parents coming back and continued focusing on my work. But a few minutes later, I realized something was off. If my parents were home, I would have heard the dogs with them. The only sound I heard when the door opened was someone stepping inside. I didn't hear my parents' voices or the dogs, or anything else. I stopped doing my homework and stood up, walking to the door. I listened carefully to see who was in the house. I heard nothing but silence. At that moment, I was confused. It was clearly not my parents, and I knew for sure it wasn't my brother. I thought about going down the stairs to check, but for some reason, I felt that was a bad idea. Instead, I quietly closed the door and went back into my room. I couldn't concentrate on studying anymore, my mind kept replaying the sound of the door opening and closing, wondering if I had imagined it all. Looking back, I started doubting myself. Suddenly, I heard someone walking up the stairs. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs and then moved toward my bedroom. I began to panic, genuinely worried that someone would enter my room. I had no lock on my door, so they could easily walk in if they wanted to. As the footsteps approached my room, they passed by and went to the end of the hallway. There was a bathroom and my parents' bedroom, as well as the living room. My brother's room was directly across the hall. I heard someone near my parents' bedroom and the living room, and without thinking much, I rushed out of my room, opened the door, and ran down the stairs. I didn't look back to see who was in the house. I felt this was my best chance to escape. As I ran down the stairs, I headed straight for the front door. I then ran outside and started sprinting down the street. I can't tell you if someone in the house was chasing me, the memory of the event is just a blur. When I reached the street, I began to run until I saw my parents returning with the dogs. They saw me running and asked what was wrong. I told them someone had entered the house. My dad called the police, and we waited at a safe distance until they arrived. My parents had left the door unlocked when they went out. Our neighborhood wasn't known for crime, so this was a significant event. The police came, and only then did we return home. When we got back, the person who had been in our house was gone. They didn't even steal anything. After that experience, we always locked our doors. In the following weeks, there were 2 reported burglaries just a few blocks away. I thought perhaps it was the same person. I knew a man had been arrested in connection with those burglaries, but I didn't know if he was the one who entered our home. I wasn't sure if there was any way to prove it. I was just grateful that I left the house when I did. There was no way I would have stayed inside with that guy just down the hall. That was one of the scariest moments of my life. A few years ago, I lived alone in an apartment. It was on the 4th floor of a typical 5-story building. The place was quite old and near the city. My apartment had 1 bedroom and 1 bathroom, with a kitchen and living room. It wasn't very big, but it was enough for me to live in. About 3 to 4 months after I moved in, one night I woke up in the middle of the night. Immediately, I remembered hearing some noises, as if someone was in my apartment. I thought I heard footsteps near the front door. I sat up and turned on the light. The noise stopped right after. I sat on the bed for a moment before I had the courage to stand up and open the bedroom door. Eventually, I did. I looked out into the dark living room and kitchen. I turned on the light, and everything seemed normal. Maybe I had just misheard or imagined it. After looking around the apartment and checking that the door was still locked, I went back to bed. Nothing unusual happened for about a month, but then, almost exactly the same thing occurred again. I woke up in the night, hearing noise in the apartment. This time, I lay still on the bed, trying to listen closely to identify exactly what the sound was. The noises weren't loud, but it was clear someone was moving around in my apartment. All the lights in the house, including in my bedroom, were off, so I couldn't see anything. I thought about reaching out to turn on the light, but I focused on listening. Was it possible I was hearing things? Maybe I was hearing someone above or below, or perhaps it was just random sounds from the building. But no, this was definitely the sound of someone walking around in my apartment. Now the footsteps were right outside my bedroom door. Then I heard the doorknob start to turn, and the door creaked as it opened. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might jump out of my chest. I started to sweat, feeling hot as the door slowly opened. I stared at the door, and when it was about halfway open, I saw the silhouette of a man standing there. He seemed to be looking directly at me, but in the darkness, I couldn't make out any details about him, just that someone was standing there. I sat up in bed, and he stood there for about 10 seconds before I couldn't hold back any longer and screamed. As I screamed, the man stepped back and shut the door. I screamed frantically for a full minute. When I calmed down, I picked up my phone and called the police. They arrived at my apartment a while later, and when they checked around, the intruder had vanished. There was no sign of forced entry, and my door was still locked. No windows were open, and everything looked normal. I was confused by this. I was certain about what I had seen, but all I could describe to the police was that it was a tall man. I couldn't provide any further details. When the police left, it was around 2 a.m., and I hardly slept for the rest of the night. I didn't know what to do, worried that perhaps I was becoming paranoid. In the following days, things gradually returned to normal, but I still feared that it could happen again. Then I had an idea. I went to the store and bought two things: first, a lock for my bedroom door, and second, a security camera with motion detection. It was a bit expensive, but I needed answers. I installed the camera in the apartment, facing the door and most of the kitchen area, where I heard the footsteps. I hid the camera as best I could on my bookshelf and then installed the lock on my bedroom door to feel safer while sleeping. Every night before bed, I turned on the camera, but for a long time, nothing happened. Of course, I was glad about that, but at the same time, I always felt a little anxious about the intruder returning. I thought it had been about 3 weeks since the last incident, and then it happened again. Once more, I was awakened by the sound of the apartment door opening. I heard footsteps again, but this time they were much faster. They went straight toward my bedroom door and were much louder than before. The intruder tried to open the bedroom door, but this time it was locked. He violently turned the doorknob several times quickly before stopping. I screamed that someone was in the house. I called the police, and this caused whoever was outside to immediately turn around and walk straight out of my door. As soon as they left, I jumped up and quickly grabbed my camera. I went back to my bedroom, locked the door, and continued watching the footage. The camera had captured the entire incident. When I played the video, I saw a man walking into my apartment as if the door hadn't been locked. As he entered, I recognized him. It was my next-door neighbor. I didn't know him well, only knew his name was Jim, and I had briefly spoken to him once in the hallway. After seeing the video, I called the police again. When they arrived, they remembered me from before, but this time I had evidence to show them. After watching the video, they immediately went next door to confront Jim. At first, he pretended to be asleep and claimed the police woke him up. But when they told him there was video evidence, he got angry. He flatly denied it was him but then changed his story, saying he must have been sleepwalking. However, the police didn't believe him and took him in. I'm really glad they did because later Jim admitted he was fully awake the entire time. It turns out he had a spare key to my apartment, but I don't know how he got it. Regardless, I'm relieved that I don't have to worry about him anymore. This happened about a week ago. I'm 20 years old and staying with my parents during the summer. However, they went out of town for a friend's wedding, and I wasn't invited. It didn't bother me much because I didn't really know the people, and having the house to myself was kind of fun. We live in a split-level house, and my bedroom is at the front. On Friday night, I stayed up late watching a movie in the living room. I prefer the TV there because it's much bigger than mine. The couch in the living room is also super comfortable, so I decided to sleep there. On Saturday morning, I woke up, and the house was still very dark. In the living room, we have a sliding glass door that leads to the back deck. The blinds cover most of the door, and it's the main source of light. However, there was a small gap, maybe about 5 feet wide, where I could see outside, and I noticed it was raining. I glanced at the clock and saw it was almost 9:30 a.m. I sat on the couch and turned on the TV when, all of a sudden, I heard 2 knocks on the front door. The knocks were light, not very loud, but my heart started racing immediately. I know it's not a big deal to have someone knock on the door, but we live at the end of a dead-end street in a very quiet neighborhood. It's not a big area, and it's extremely rare for anyone to knock on our door for any reason. Maybe it's because I'm a shy person, but it made me really anxious. From where I was sitting on the couch, I couldn't see the front door, and I hoped whoever was outside couldn't see me either. I started wondering who it could be, especially in the middle of pouring rain. Then, I remembered that I had ordered a package from Amazon and was expecting it to arrive today. I immediately felt relieved and started to relax. I opened the Amazon app on my phone and checked my orders, hoping to see that it had been delivered. But when I looked, it said the package wouldn't arrive until 5 p.m. that day. My nervousness came rushing back. I decided to carefully check to see if anyone was still at the door. By now, it had been a minute or two since the original knocks, and there hadn't been any further knocking. I slowly moved to peek out the window, and when I did, I saw that nobody was there. This made me feel a little better now that they were gone, but right at that moment, I heard footsteps coming up the stairs of our back deck. I couldn't see anything because the blinds were covering most of the sliding glass door, but I definitely heard footsteps on the deck. I started trembling, and the next thing I knew, I saw a man appear in the small opening of the sliding glass door where I could see outside. He was staring straight at me with no expression on his face. He was bald, wearing a black jacket and black pants. The man then tried to open the sliding door. The door was thankfully locked, but I knew if he really wanted to, he could probably break through the glass separating us. I immediately ran to the bathroom down the hall. I had no idea who this man was or why he was here, but my earlier nervousness, which seemed unreasonable, was now completely justified. As soon as I closed and locked the bathroom door, I heard the first loud bang on the window, like he was trying to break it. I realized I needed to call the police, but then remembered I left my phone back in the living room. Another loud bang echoed from the window, but still, the glass hadn't shattered. Knowing I had no choice, I risked it, opened the door, and dashed towards the living room. Frantically scanning the area, I spotted my phone and quickly grabbed it, racing back to the bathroom just as another bang struck the window. Glancing back, I saw him kicking the glass, trying to break it. Once inside, I locked the door again and dialed 911. As soon as the operator answered, I explained the situation, trying to stay calm. They told me to slow down and repeat what was happening, and that's when I heard the sound of glass shattering. I tried to explain everything as best as I could, and soon after, I heard the man entering the house, his footsteps headed directly for the bathroom I was hiding in. When he reached the door, he tried to open it, but luckily, it was locked. I backed away and hid inside the shower. The 911 operator reassured me they would stay on the line, which made me feel a bit safer, although I was still terrified. Then, the man started banging on the bathroom door, and suddenly, my phone went silent. I looked down to find that it had died. I hadn't charged it the night before. I guessed he would kick the door like he did with the sliding glass door, and I feared he might break through this one too. Then, I heard him walk away briefly and head down the stairs. He was gone for maybe a minute before I heard his footsteps returning. This time, the bang on the bathroom door was much harder. I think he had found a baseball bat we had in the house or something similar. My fear escalated even more. I grabbed the towels in the bathroom to cover myself and then squeezed into the small bathroom closet, closing the door behind me. I barely fit, but I had no other choice. The men hit the door a few more times, and now it sounded like it was really starting to break. But suddenly, the noise was interrupted by another sound, a loud knock at the front door, and I faintly heard someone shouting "Police." I hoped they would get inside quickly, and soon, I heard the men walking away toward the back of the house, where he had entered. I stayed hidden, and moments later, I heard loud shouting and someone yelling, "Put it down." When I finally heard multiple police voices inside my house, I came out of the bathroom. They had arrived just in time, and the man was caught. I'm incredibly lucky the police arrived as fast as they did. This happened recently, and I'm still a little shaken, but I'm just glad to be okay. Last year, I was home alone one night. I live in a small house in a quiet neighborhood. It was around 10 p.m. when I heard knocking at my front door. It felt strange to have someone knocking at such a late hour. I walked over and looked out the window near the front door, and saw a small woman, probably around 25 to 30 years old, standing there. I had never seen her before and was unsure why she was there. After thinking for a moment, I decided to answer the door. The woman greeted me and said her car had broken down on my street, just a little further down the road. She mentioned that she had already knocked on the doors of 2 of my neighbors, but no one answered. I asked if she had tried calling for roadside assistance, and she said she couldn't get a signal around here. I looked in the direction she pointed, but at first, I didn't see any car. I asked her where exactly her car was, and she told me to follow her, then asked if I knew anything about fixing cars. I did have some knowledge, though I wouldn't call myself an expert, but I've fixed a few things on my own cars before. I've always been interested in cars and how they work, so I was curious. As we talked, she began walking back towards where her car supposedly was. She said that her power and everything in the car just started going off, and then it died. I followed her down my driveway and into the street. When I got onto the quiet road, I noticed a little way down, a car parked on the side. It looked like a fairly new Honda CR-V. The car was positioned past my next-door neighbor's house. After his house, the road curved, and there were no houses for a stretch, just woods on both sides. We finally got within about 15 feet of her vehicle, and I noticed the windows were tinted very dark. The woman walked over to the driver's door and unlocked the car. That was the moment I saw the back 2 doors of her car open, and 2 men stepped out, 1 from each side. I was only about 10 feet away from them. As soon as I saw them, I turned around and sprinted as fast as I could in the opposite direction. There were 2 of them and just 1 of me, and I had nothing to defend myself with, so staying there was not an option. I heard the men start to run after me, and I didn't even know I could run that fast. Somehow, I made it back to my front door and got inside, locking it just a second before the men reached it and tried to get in. Once inside, I wasted no time finding my phone and calling the police. Unfortunately, the men left within a minute and were gone by the time the police arrived. Everyone was gone, and I explained everything that happened, but I didn't get the license plate of the car. I provided a description of the people, but the car was quite common, and I really didn't get a good look at the men, so I don't know if they were ever located. At the end of the day, I'm just glad to be okay. I came within seconds of who knows what. I feel kind of foolish for falling for that and am now more suspicious of people. About a year ago, I lived in an apartment by myself. I'm in a new apartment now, and the one I lived in last year wasn't great. It was a small 1-bedroom place on the 2nd floor. I had a very small balcony, which was nice. One night, I was home alone cooking dinner. I cook quite often and was at the stove in the kitchen. It was early spring, and the weather was still somewhat cold outside. I remember starting to feel really hot while cooking, which happens often. I walked over to the sliding door on my balcony and opened it. As I did, I felt the cool air rush in, then went back to cooking. About 20 minutes later, while still in the kitchen, I heard a noise. I looked over and saw someone standing in the opening of my sliding glass door. It was a guy I didn't recognize. At first, I was too confused and surprised to say or do anything. The man just stood there, then walked right inside and headed into my bedroom, shutting the door behind him. Finally, I shouted, "Who are you?" I yelled it again, louder this time, but whoever had entered my bedroom didn't answer. I heard noises coming from inside, and I was still standing in the kitchen, right by the front door. Then my bedroom door started to open. When that happened, I opened my front door and ran out. I dashed down the hallway into the stairs. I wanted to call the police, but it wasn't until I reached the stairs that I realized I didn't have my cell phone. I had left it on the kitchen counter. Instead, I decided to keep going. I didn't want to go back in there. I left the building and went out to my car in the parking lot. I sat inside and thought about what to do. I considered driving to a friend's house or the police station, but I didn't know where the police station was and didn't want to show up at my friend's house without letting them know what was going on. After about an hour, I decided to go back inside my apartment. Whatever that guy was doing, he was probably gone by now. I left my car and went back inside. When I got to my apartment, I opened the door and saw my place was a mess. My things were all over the floor, and the furniture was out of place. However, I didn't see or hear anyone. I noticed that my balcony door was now closed. I ventured further inside, but as soon as I reached the doorway of my bedroom, I saw the guy again. I turned and bolted out of my apartment. This time, I pounded on my next-door neighbor's door. I had never met my neighbors, but I didn't care. They actually opened the door, and I told them someone had broken into my apartment and asked them to call the police. They let me inside their apartment, and we waited for the police to arrive. When they got there, the man was still inside my apartment and was caught. He had taken my phone and had a backpack filled with my belongings that he intended to steal. I really can't believe he stayed in my apartment for so long. He got in by climbing up to my balcony and entering through the open door. I guess he saw my door open from a distance. I'm just glad he was caught. This is my scariest experience of being home alone. It happened when I was 12 years old. It was a long time ago now, but I still remember it very clearly. At that time, I lived with my parents, older sister, and younger brother. It was very rare for me to be home alone, but somehow it happened. It was a Friday evening, and my dad was out of town until the next morning for work. He didn't travel for work often, but every now and then he did. I remember my sister was at her best friend's house and was going to sleep over there. My mom and brother were at a birthday party my brother was invited to, but I was not. My mom went with him because she was helping the birthday kid's mom with the party. So, that left me home alone on a Friday night. My big plans were to relax and play video games. I was excited about it because I rarely got the whole place to myself. Our house was pretty average, with 2 levels. All the bedrooms were upstairs. Downstairs were the living room, dining room, and kitchen. So after my mom left that afternoon, shortly after I got back from school, she gave me instructions on how to make a frozen pizza. I had never cooked before, but I loved frozen pizza, and at about 7 p.m., I cooked it. Everything went pretty well, and then I went into the living room and sat in an office chair right in front of the TV, starting to play on my PlayStation. This went on for several hours. At about 9 o'clock at night, I heard the sound of somebody stepping onto the front step where our door was. The living room was at the front of the house, so it really wasn't that far away. When I heard the person walk onto the front step, I assumed it was my mom and brother returning from the birthday party. I kept playing, expecting to hear the door open at any moment, but after several minutes, nothing happened, nobody entered the house. Curious, I got up and walked over to the front door to look outside. When I did, I didn't see anybody there, there was no one at the front door, and my mom's car was not in the driveway either. As I was looking, something caught my eye to the left. I looked and saw what appeared to be a man walking through the front yard. He was barely in my sight for about a second before disappearing from view. He had gone toward the side of the house or maybe into the neighbor's yard. I felt a little nervous after this, but I assumed the man had left. I didn't know who he was or what he was doing. I kept watching around the front yard for a minute or so and saw nothing more, so I returned to my video games. I couldn't shake the creepiness of what I had seen, so I tried to take my mind off it. After about 10 minutes, it seemed to work, until suddenly, I heard the sound of someone trying to open the back door to the house. Our back door was connected to the kitchen and led out to the patio. This sound was much louder, and I instantly stood up. I ran over to the phone and called my mom. During this time, I didn't hear any more noises. I told my mom that somebody had tried coming in through the back door, and she told me to call the police. She said she would be home as soon as she could, but the birthday party was still going on. After that, I quickly ran upstairs and into my bedroom. Once there, I called the police and told them I thought someone was trying to break in. After giving them my address, I hid behind my bed and covered myself with tons of blankets. I was too scared to know what was going on. As I waited for the police to arrive, I hoped the men had just left and hadn't tried breaking in. I wasn't hearing anything, but then again, I was under blankets. It felt like forever, but maybe 10 minutes later, the police arrived. I remember getting a call on the phone telling me they were there. I never would have gone down and left my bedroom on my own when that happened. I got up but heard people talking, so I stayed in my bedroom. A while later, there was a knock at my bedroom door. I was terrified until I heard a voice on the other side say, "Police." Then I answered the door, and there was an officer. He told me they had caught a man who had just broken in. I was told that the police got there in the nick of time, and they really did. The man had somehow managed to open the back door to the house. He had literally just entered when the police arrived. The man was arrested and, luckily, hadn't gotten far into the house. I was honestly shocked when I heard it, but luckily, everything turned out fine. He wasn't able to steal anything or cause any damage. The back door needed a little fixing, but it wasn't a huge deal. After that, though, I didn't want to stay home alone for a while. This story happened when I was a kid. I was probably around 12. Back then, I would ride the bus to and from school every day. My parents both worked until 5 o'clock and would get home between 5:30 and 6 o'clock, but I would get home at about 2:45 to 3 p.m. from school every day, so usually, I had a few hours to myself. One day, the school bus dropped me off at the end of my street like every other day. I walked on the sidewalk until I got to my house and then went inside. My after-school routine was usually to go to my room and try to get my homework out of the way first. Then I would relax and do whatever I wanted until my parents got home. This time, I did my homework at the kitchen table. As I was doing it, I remember looking out the window and seeing a man walking on the sidewalk out front. He walked past our house, and I didn't think much of it. We usually didn't get too many people walking down the sidewalk, but an occasional person wasn't a big deal. However, I later saw him walking by the other way again about 10 minutes later, and he kind of looked over. Still, it wasn't a huge deal. The kitchen was at the front of the house, and after I finished my homework, it was probably around 4 p.m. I moved into the living room and turned on the TV. Just a few minutes later, I heard our front door opening. Now, I knew instantly that it probably wasn't either of my parents. I'm not sure how I knew that, but I just had a bad feeling. They were rarely home that early, and when they were, they would usually let me know. Then I realized that I had forgotten to lock the front door when I got home that day. I jumped up off the couch and didn't know what to do. I ended up going right behind the couch to hide. I had no time to go anywhere else. The person walked inside. I was in the kitchen for about a minute, then I heard their footsteps moving closer, and they entered the living room where I was. My heart was racing. There was a little bit of space between the couch and the walls behind it, and that's where I was lying on the carpet. I couldn't see anything, and my head was down. Now that the person was walking on carpet, I couldn't hear their footsteps anymore. I tried my best to be as silent as possible. The seconds felt like minutes. I didn't hear anything. I was afraid that whoever was in there knew I was present, but then I heard footsteps again in the kitchen. The footsteps soon moved to the stairs, and I heard the person walking up. I felt slightly relieved, but there was still somebody in our house. I thought about hiding there until the person left, but when they reached the top of the stairs, I realized I could probably leave if I got up and ran. I should be able to reach the front door before the person could. I couldn't really hear their footsteps anymore since they were upstairs, so I didn't know exactly where they were. I carefully got out from behind the couch and stood up, then, as quietly as I could, ran for the front door. I opened it and went outside. From there, I ran down the street to a neighbor that my family was pretty good friends with. I knocked on her door, and luckily, she answered. She let me come inside and then called the police. It felt great to finally be safe again, but the person was still in my house. The police response time was really fast. They were there within about 5 minutes. My neighbor and I watched from her window when they arrived. They soon entered our house and searched it. Unfortunately, the person was gone. I went back to the house with the police, and everything was in order except for my bedroom door upstairs, which was open. That gave me an eerie feeling. Not long after, I found out that the police had found a suspicious man in another neighbor's backyard. When I saw what he looked like, it was the same guy I had seen walking on the sidewalk earlier. I couldn't believe it. He later admitted to being inside our house. My parents got home shortly after, and the police stayed for a while to talk with everyone. Soon they left, and things returned to normal for the most part. That experience made me not want to be home alone for a while, but it also reminded me to always lock the door. A strange thing happened to me a couple of years ago. At the time, I lived in an apartment by myself. It was a one-bedroom unit on the second floor of the building. Overall, the apartment wasn't the nicest, and it didn't have that many units in it either. I knew a few of my neighbors, but not all of them. One night, I was at home by myself like usual. It was sometime at night, I really don't know the exact time, but there was a knock on my door. I walked over and answered it without giving it much thought. A man was standing there. He was kind of short and had dark brown hair. The man told me he was my neighbor from down the hallway and pointed to the left. He asked if he could come inside my apartment to make a phone call. He said his Wi-Fi wasn't working, and he didn't have any service on his phone at the time, so without Wi-Fi, he couldn't make any calls. I wasn't comfortable with this. I told the man, sorry, but no. He said he would be really quick, and I told him I really couldn't help him. For some reason, he came across as a little sketchy to me. The man turned to walk away, and I closed my door. I was really curious afterward. I had never seen the men before and had seen most of the people who lived in the building since it wasn't all that big. I thought maybe the guy would knock on another person's door, so I quietly opened my door and looked around the corner to see him walking away. He walked all the way to the end of the hall and then went inside the elevator. I was suspicious that he didn't even live there. At one point or another, I had seen just about everyone who lived on my floor. After the men left, I went to one of the windows in my place. I looked out into the guest parking lot where the main doors open up. Now, there are assigned parking spaces for all the residents under the building. There's a small guest parking lot with about 10 spaces out front. I saw the men leave the building and walk to an older-looking car in the guest parking lot and drive away. He definitely didn't live there, so why would he lie to me and claim that he did? I didn't know, but the fact that he wanted me to let him inside my apartment kind of creeped me out. He certainly made up the whole story about his Wi-Fi being down and him not having any cell phone service. I'm not sure how he got into the building in the first place, but most likely somebody else let him in when they were entering. After that night, I never saw him again, which pretty much confirmed that he didn't live there. I'm really glad I didn't let him inside my apartment. When I was a kid, my parents used to leave me home alone sometimes. Both my parents worked, and they stopped getting a babysitter for me when I was around 10. I'm an only child, so I got used to being home alone pretty quickly. I was able to make several foods for myself and have snacks, but most of the time I would just sit and watch TV or hang out in my room. The house we lived in was one level and had a basement as well. There were 3 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms on the main floor, along with the living room and kitchen. It wasn't a very big house, but it wasn't tiny either, and it never felt like we didn't have enough space. At the time of this story, I was probably about. When I was 12 years old, one night I was home by myself. I really don't remember where exactly my parents were that night, but they were both gone. My mom had cooked me some food before they left, so I had it while watching TV in the living room. Then I went into my bedroom. For the next hour or so, I just kind of hung out in there, playing on my Nintendo DS and watching the smaller TV that was in my bedroom. It was probably around 8:30 or 9 p.m. at this point, and it was completely dark outside. That's when I heard our sliding glass door opening. I was used to hearing that noise because my parents went in and out to the patio all the time. The sliding glass door was connected to the dining room area by the kitchen, and it was at the back corner of the house. We had a little patio with a table and a grill. About 5 seconds after I heard this noise, I realized it was strange that my parents weren't home. Who could have done that? We didn't have any neighbors who would just come over or anything like that, and I suddenly became very worried very quickly. I started to panic, and I didn't know what to do. This kind of situation had never happened to me before, and in fact, I had never really thought about it being a possibility. The neighborhood was always quiet and calm, and it seemed just like any other night to me. I tried thinking quickly about who could be there, but I couldn't think of anybody. My bedroom door was not completely closed either, it was open about a foot. I thought about getting up and closing it, but I didn't want to make any noise, so I stayed where I was sitting on my bed. One thing I noticed, though, was that I didn't hear anybody walking around inside the house. We had wood floors in the living room and dining room, so I probably would have heard whoever was there walking. My TV was playing with the volume pretty low, so I knew I would have heard footsteps. I sat there on my bed, not moving, listening closely for any noise, but I didn't hear anything. After a few moments, I grabbed my TV remote, which was next to me, and turned the volume all the way down. I listened very closely for probably another 30 seconds to a minute, but I still heard nothing. I wondered if I had actually heard the sliding door close. I definitely had. This was really strange, but after not hearing anything for a while longer, I started to feel better. I was convincing myself that nothing was wrong. Soon, I decided that I would have a look for myself. I got up from my bed and walked over to the doorway. My bedroom led into the hallway, and to the right was the living room. The dining room and kitchen were not in view from the hallway. You had to walk through the living room and then take a right to get to it. After looking around in the living room and seeing nothing, I stepped out. I walked through the living room and then into the dining room and kitchen, but still, I didn't see or hear anybody. This made me think that nobody was there. When I looked at the sliding glass door, it was closed but not locked. Now, this was a little concerning, but nobody seemed to be inside the house. Maybe a neighbor saw that it was open and closed it or something. That was bizarre, but it was the thought that came to my head. I don't know why, but I tried thinking if the door had been open or closed when I had been out in the living room and kitchen before. I couldn't remember, though, to be honest, most of the time I wouldn't even notice. Maybe one of my parents had forgotten to close it or lock it. I walked over to the door and locked it. Then I looked around at the patio and backyard. Our yard was pretty small, but we did have a bit of grass and a few plants and trees. Everything seemed fine from what I could see, and after that, I walked back over to my bedroom. I really didn't know how to explain the bizarre sound that I heard, but I guessed that it could be nothing. After returning to my bedroom, though, I decided to look outside to my backyard from my bedroom window. I usually had the window covered with blinds, as it was on this night. I lifted them up and looked out. Everything seemed fine from what I could see. Right after this, I returned to my bed, but I was thirsty and my water glass was empty, so I picked it up and headed to the kitchen to get a refill. After I walked to the fridge and was filling my glass, I heard another sound. It was coming from the living room. Somebody was definitely in there, and I started to hear footsteps. The closest exit that I was near was the sliding glass door, and I sprinted for it right away. I unlocked it, opened the door, and ran out without even closing it behind me. I was probably the scaredest I had ever been. I didn't see whoever was there at all, but I knew somebody was inside the house. When I got outside, I sprinted out of the yard and around the house to the street, then I started running down the street, just trying to get as far away from my house as I could. I'm not really sure where I was planning to go, but as long as I was away from my house, I felt safe. Luckily, at this time, I had recently gotten my first cell phone. I had it with me in my pocket, and I took it out and called my mom. When I told her what had happened, she said that she was calling the police and my parents would head home immediately. In the meantime, I just kind of walked around the streets of my neighborhood. Eventually, I got another call from my mom asking where I was, and when I told her, she and my dad were there within a minute or two to pick me up. I got inside their car, and we drove to our house, which had several police cars in front of it now. I waited in the car with my mom as my dad talked to the officers to know the situation. When he came back, he said that the guy who had been inside the house was gone. The police hadn't found anybody inside, however, the house had several things in it that were messed up. One of the blankets that was on the couch was now on the floor, and I hadn't put it there. The doors to my parents' bedroom and the basement were also left open and had been closed before, but surprisingly, nothing was stolen from the house at all. We all went back inside a short time later, and I was pretty scared for the rest of the night. The guy never came back, though, and I never saw him again. I'm just glad that I left when I did and got out of there. This happened back when I was younger. I believe that I was about 14 at the time. I remember it pretty well, and it all started on a Friday night. My parents were going out of town to go to a wedding that I was not invited to. I didn't care, though. I found weddings boring and would rather stay home and play video games. My parents left on Friday afternoon after I got back from school. I was sort of excited to have the house to myself for a little while. My mom let me order a pizza to be delivered that night, and I got it and then watched TV in the living room. Maybe an hour into that, at about 8 p.m. or so, there was a knock at the front door. I didn't know who it could possibly be. I felt a little bit nervous as I got up from the couch to go check. I looked out of a window and saw a man standing there. He was not a neighbor, and I didn't know him at all. The man was wearing a black jacket and a winter hat. He also had a slight beard. There was no way that I was answering the door, though. He knocked again, and I just stood there waiting for him to go away. I was pretty confident that he couldn't see me from where I was. Eventually, I saw the man turn and walk away. I was a little bit creeped out, and I didn't know who the guy was or why he came to our house, but I figured that was that, and I went back to what I was doing. Maybe 30 minutes to an hour later, I decided to go up to my room and play some video games. I went upstairs, got into my bedroom, shut off the lights, and closed the door. Then I got in my gaming chair and put my headset on. I had a pretty good setup in there and really enjoyed it. Probably 30 minutes into that, I was interrupted, though. I heard a knock on the door, but it wasn't the front door to the house, it was coming from my bedroom door. My heart started racing like crazy, and I became as scared as can be. I didn't know what to do. Very quietly, I got up from my chair and then turned the TV off. Now it was completely dark in there, and I could see very little. I was kind of expecting the door to just open, but it didn't. I got down on the ground, careful not to make any noise. My gaming chair was sort of in the corner of the room, away from the door. My closet was half open and just a few feet from me. I crawled over there quietly and was careful not to make a sound. Then they knocked again. Somebody was right outside my door, and I figured that it was probably the man who had knocked on the front door earlier in the night. I was able to crawl my way into my bedroom closet. It was not that big, but there was enough space for me to fit inside of it. Plus, my room was pretty messy. As a teenager, I had clothes and stuff lying all around the floor and basically a huge pile of clothes in my closet. As I went inside of it, I carefully covered myself with clothes. In the middle of doing this, I heard the door start to open. I froze and just hoped that I was not visible. I did not hear the guy walk inside but could tell that he was in there.